the state of Franklin, America's 14th state, that actually existed. In 1784, a group of frontier settlers in the mountains of what is now eastern Tennessee did something extraordinary. They declared independence from North Carolina, wrote their own constitution, elected their own governor, established their own courts and militia, and operated as a fully independent state for 4 years. They called their new nation the State of Franklin, named in honor of Benjamin Franklin, hoping the famous statesman's endorsement would help them gain admission to the United States as the 14th state. It almost worked. The state of Franklin had everything a legitimate government needs: executive, legislative, and judicial branches, tax collection systems, treaty negotiations with Native American tribes, and even its own currency. For 4 tumultuous years, from 1784 to 1788, Franklin existed as a functioning, if embattled, independent entity on the American frontier. Then it collapsed, erased from maps, and relegated to a historical footnote. Today, few Americans know that their country once had a 14th state, or that parts of Tennessee briefly existed outside the authority of both state and federal government. This is the forgotten story of the state of Franklin, America's lost state, and a fascinating glimpse into the chaotic, uncertain years following the Revolutionary War, when the shape of the nation was still being decided. The frontier, nobody wanted to understand why Franklin came into existence. You need to understand the peculiar situation of the American frontier in the 1780s. The Revolutionary War had ended in 1783, but the new nation was far from stable. The Articles of Confederation created a weak federal government with almost no real authority. The states were essentially independent entities, jealous of their sovereignty and suspicious of central power. Western territories presented a particular problem. The Proclamation of 1763 had forbidden colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, but Americans had ignored this restriction even before independence. By the 1780s, thousands of settlers had crossed the mountains into what was then the western frontier of North Carolina, the region that would become eastern Tennessee. These settlers were tough, independent-minded people who had carved farms and communities out of wilderness, often in the face of hostile resistance from Cherokee and other Native American nations whose lands they were occupying. They were hundreds of miles from the North Carolina government in Raleigh, across mountain ranges that made communication and governance extremely difficult. From the settlers' perspective, North Carolina provided them with nothing: no protection from Native American raids, no courts to settle disputes, no schools or infrastructure. They were on their own, yet expected to pay taxes to a distant government that offered them no services. From North Carolina's perspective, the western settlements were a financial drain and a political headache. The territory was expensive to defend and difficult to govern. The state was drowning in Revolutionary War debt and desperately needed money. This mutual resentment set the stage for separation, North Carolina's fateful decision. In April 1784, the North Carolina legislature made a decision that seemed to solve everyone's problems. They voted to cede their western lands to the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. The logic was straightforward. Let Congress deal with the headache of governing the frontier while North Carolina focused on paying down its war debt. The Western settlers were not consulted about this decision. They learned about it after the fact, and many were outraged. Being transferred to federal control meant even more distant government, even less representation, and uncertainty about land titles and property rights. Some feared the federal government might sell their lands to speculators or that their claims wouldn't be recognized. But before the cession could be finalized, North Carolina had second thoughts. The legislature, under pressure from land speculators and politicians who saw value in the Western territories, repealed the Cession Act in October 1784. The Western lands would remain part of North Carolina after all. This reversal created a crisis. For 6 months, the Western settlements had existed in legal limbo, technically ceded to a federal government that hadn't yet accepted them, then suddenly reclaimed by a state government they resented. The settlers decided they'd had enough of being political pawns. If North Carolina didn't want them, and Congress couldn't or wouldn't take them, they would govern themselves. The birth of Franklin. In August 1784, delegates from the Western settlements gathered at Jonesboro for a convention. The atmosphere was electric with revolutionary fervor. These were men who had just fought a war for independence from distant authority, and now they were being asked to submit to another distant authority they felt didn't represent them. The convention declared the Western settlements independent of North Carolina. They would form their own state, which they initially called Franklin, meaning land of the free, though this was soon changed to Franklin to honor Benjamin Franklin and curry favor with one of America's most respected statesmen. In December 1784, they held elections. John Sevier, a Revolutionary War hero and Indian fighter beloved on the frontier, was elected governor. Sevier was the perfect choice, a proven military leader, experienced politician, and someone who commanded respect among the tough-minded frontiersmen who made up Franklin's population. The new state quickly established a government structure modeled on other American states. They created a bicameral legislature called the General Assembly, established county courts, organized a militia, and even set up a system for collecting taxes, though this last proved predictably unpopular and difficult to enforce. By early 1785, the state of Franklin was a functioning government controlling a territory of roughly 10,000 square miles and governing approximately 5,000 families. They had their own laws, their own courts, their own military forces. In every practical sense, Franklin was an independent state. The Constitution debate, one of the most fascinating aspects of Franklin's history, was the debate over its Constitution. Two competing visions for the state's fundamental law emerged, reflecting deeper philosophical divisions about democracy and governance. The first proposed Constitution was radically democratic for its time. Written by Reverend Samuel Houston, a cousin of the future Texas hero Sam Houston, it contained provisions that were shockingly progressive for 1784. It would have banned lawyers and doctors from serving in the legislature, reflecting frontier suspicion of professional elites. It required legislators to be farmers or mechanics, ensuring the government would be run by working men rather than aristocrats. It mandated free schools to educate all children, regardless of their parents' wealth. This Constitution was ultimately rejected as too radical. Instead, Franklin adopted a more conservative Constitution closely modeled on North Carolina's, with property requirements for voting and office holding. But the mere fact that such a democratic constitution was seriously proposed shows how the frontier environment fostered political experimentation and challenges to traditional hierarchies. The adopted Constitution established Franklin as a republic with separation of powers, guaranteed trial by jury, and protected freedom of religion. It was, in most respects, typical of American state constitutions of the era, which was exactly the point. Franklin wanted to prove it could be a legitimate, respectable state worthy of admission to the Union. The currency of independence. One of Franklin's most colorful innovations was its approach to currency and taxation. The state was desperately poor in hard money. Gold and silver coins were scarce on the frontier, but Franklin's citizens were rich in the products of their farms and forests. So Franklin established a system where taxes and official fees could be paid in commodities. The official fee schedule survives in historical records, and it's a fascinating glimpse into frontier economics. A marriage license, 1 deerskin. Filing a land deed, 2 deerskins court clerk's fee for issuing a warrant, 1 raccoon, pelt justice of the peace annual salary, 200 deerskins, county clerk annual salary, 300 deerskins, or equivalent in beaver, otter, or fox pelts. Whiskey, which was easier to transport than grain and served as a form of currency throughout the frontier, was also accepted for many transactions. Livestock could be used to pay larger debts or taxes. This commodity-based system was practical for a cash-poor frontier economy, but it created administrative headaches. How did you make change in deerskins? What was the exchange rate between beaver pelts and whiskey? The system worked well enough in local transactions, but made dealings with outside governments and merchants difficult. The fight for recognition. From the beginning, Franklin's leaders knew that without formal recognition, their state would remain precarious. They needed admission to the United States as the 14th state to gain legitimacy and protection. Governor Sevier wrote to the Continental Congress requesting admission. He also wrote to Benjamin Franklin himself, hoping the great man would endorse the state named in his honor. Franklin's response, if any, has been lost to history, but he never publicly supported the breakaway state. Congress debated Franklin's petition in 1785. Under the Articles of Confederation, admitting a new state required approval from 9 of the 13 existing states. Franklin came tantalizingly close. 7 states voted in favor of admission. But it wasn't enough. 2 more votes, and Franklin would have become a permanent part of the United States. Instead, it remained in constitutional limbo. North Carolina, unsurprisingly, vigorously opposed Franklin's statehood. From Raleigh's perspective, Franklin was an illegal rebellion by citizens who had no right to separate. North Carolina continued to claim sovereignty over the territory and worked to undermine Franklin's government at every turn. This created an absurd situation where 2 competing governments claimed authority over the same territory. Some settlers recognized Franklin's authority and paid taxes to Governor Sevier's government. Others remained loyal to North Carolina and paid their taxes to Raleigh. Some tried to play both sides, pledging allegiance to whichever government seemed more advantageous at any given moment. The Indian problem, Franklin's relationship with Native American tribes, particularly the Cherokee, was one of its most serious challenges and ultimately contributed to its downfall. The Cherokee occupied lands in and around Franklin's claimed territory. They had already lost enormous amounts of land to white encroachment and were determined to hold what remained. From their perspective, Franklin settlers were illegal squatters who had no right to Cherokee lands, regardless of what government they claimed to represent. Governor Sevier, desperate to secure Franklin's borders and satisfy land-hungry settlers, negotiated several treaties with Cherokee leaders. The Treaty of Dumpling Creek in 1785 and subsequent agreements ceded significant Cherokee lands to Franklin in exchange for trade goods and promises of peace. But these treaties were controversial even among the Cherokee. Many Cherokee leaders, particularly the war chief Dragging Canoe, rejected the treaties as invalid and continued to resist white expansion. Sporadic violence erupted into open warfare, with Cherokee warriors raiding Franklin settlements and Franklin militia retaliating with attacks on Cherokee villages. This conflict created a dangerous situation for Franklin. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, claimed authority over Indian affairs and treaty-making. By negotiating its own treaties, Franklin was asserting a sovereign power that challenged federal authority. Congress and many state governments viewed Franklin's Indian diplomacy as further evidence that it was an illegitimate rogue entity. The collapse begins. By 1787, Franklin was in serious trouble. The state had never achieved the recognition it needed to survive. North Carolina's competing government controlled some of the same territory, creating confusion and dividing the population's loyalties. Federal authorities refused to acknowledge Franklin's existence. Economically, the state was struggling. The commodity-based tax system wasn't generating enough revenue to fund government operations. Many settlers simply refused to pay taxes at all, reasoning that they could claim allegiance to North Carolina if Franklin's government tried to enforce collection. Militarily, the continuing conflict with the Cherokee was draining resources and manpower. Settlers were being killed in raids, crops were being destroyed, and Franklin's militia was stretched thin, trying to defend a large territory with limited resources. Politically, divisions were emerging within Franklin itself. Some leaders began to question whether independence was sustainable. Others, including Governor Sevier, remained committed to Franklin's sovereignty, but were increasingly isolated. In 1788, North Carolina made a decisive move. The state government began actively reasserting its authority in the Western Territories, establishing courts and appointing officials loyal to Raleigh. They also pardoned Franklin supporters who agreed to acknowledge North Carolina's sovereignty, offering an easy path back for those tired of Franklin's uncertain status. Many settlers took the deal. Franklin's support began to crumble as pragmatism overcame revolutionary idealism. People needed stable government, legitimate land titles and protection, and North Carolina, for all its faults, could provide those things better than embattled Franklin. The final days. The end came not with a dramatic battle, but with a whimper. In early 1788, Governor Sevier attempted to arrest a North Carolina official operating in Franklin's territory. The official resisted and violence erupted. Sevier found himself briefly imprisoned by North Carolina authorities, though he was soon released. This humiliation effectively marked the end of Franklin's independence. Sevier, recognizing that the cause was lost, eventually accepted North Carolina's authority. The Franklin government simply dissolved, its officials returning to private life or accepting positions in North Carolina's government. By March 1789, the state of Franklin had ceased to exist. It had lasted 4 years, longer than many historians give it credit for, but ultimately couldn't overcome the fundamental challenges of legitimacy, resources, and divided loyalties. What happened next? The story has an interesting epilogue. In 1789, the new U.S. Constitution went into effect, replacing the weak Articles of Confederation with a stronger federal government. North Carolina ratified the Constitution and, in 1790, finally ceded its western territories to the federal government. These territories became the Southwest Territory, a federal territory governed from Washington. In 1796, just 8 years after Franklin's collapse, the territory achieved what Franklin never could: statehood. Tennessee became the 16th state of the United States. Governor John Sevier, the man who had led Franklin's independence movement, became Tennessee's first governor. He served 6 terms and is today honored as one of Tennessee's greatest early leaders. His former rebellion was forgiven and largely forgotten, or at least reframed as an understandable reaction to difficult circumstances rather than treasonous insurrection. Many of Franklin's laws and governmental structures were adopted by the new state of Tennessee. In a sense, Franklin lived on in its successor, even if the name and the formal independence were gone. Legacy and memory. Today, the state of Franklin exists primarily in the memories of local historians and history enthusiasts in eastern Tennessee. The region celebrates its brief independence with historical markers, museums, and the occasional festival. Jonesboro, Franklin's capital, preserves buildings from the era and promotes its role in this forgotten chapter of American history. Several counties in the region, including Greene County, where Greeneville, note the different spelling, served as Franklin's capital, maintain historical societies dedicated to preserving Franklin's story. The Tennessee state government officially recognizes Franklin as a significant part of state history, even if it was technically a rebellion against legitimate authority. The state of Franklin appears in Tennessee history textbooks and local lore, a source of regional pride about the independent spirit of the mountain settlers who weren't afraid to govern themselves when distant authorities failed them. What Franklin tells us about America. The state of Franklin's story reveals important truths about the early American Republic. The years immediately following the Revolutionary War were far more chaotic and uncertain than we often remember. The shape of the nation was not predetermined. It was actively contested by competing visions, interests, and regional identities. Franklin demonstrates that in the 1780s it was genuinely unclear what the United States would become. Would it be a loose confederation of essentially independent states? Would new states be easily admitted, creating an expanding republic? Would frontier regions have the right to self-determination, or would they be subordinate to the original 13 states? The failure of Franklin to achieve statehood showed that the federal system, even under the weak Articles of Confederation, would not tolerate unlimited fragmentation. There had to be orderly processes for territorial governance and state admission. The chaos of competing sovereignties in the same territory couldn't be allowed to continue. But Franklin also showed that frontier settlers had real grievances and genuine capacity for self-government. The eventual admission of Tennessee as a state vindicated many of Franklin's arguments, even if the state itself didn't survive to see it. The might-have-been state. It's tempting to imagine what would have happened if Franklin had gained those 2 additional votes in Congress in 1785. Would American history have been significantly different? Probably not in major ways. Tennessee would still have eventually been settled, and the region would still have become a state. But Franklin's success might have created precedents for easier admission of new western states, potentially accelerating westward expansion. It might have strengthened the idea that frontier communities had the right to self-determination. Alternatively, Franklin's success might have encouraged other separatist movements, potentially fragmenting the young nation into dozens of small states before a stronger federal government could be established. The founders' fears about excessive fragmentation might have been realized. We'll never know. History doesn't reveal its alternative paths. What we do know is that for 4 years the state of Franklin existed as more than just an idea. It was a functioning government that collected taxes in deerskins, passed laws, negotiated treaties, fought wars, and governed thousands of people. Conclusion: the state, that time forgot, the state of Franklin was America's 14th state, except it wasn't. It had everything a state needed, except the one thing that mattered most: recognition. Without that formal acknowledgement from Congress and the other states, Franklin remained a legal fiction, a government without legitimacy, an independence that existed in practice but not in law. Its collapse was probably inevitable. The forces arrayed against it, North Carolina's determination to maintain its territory, Congress's reluctance to encourage separatism, the practical difficulties of governing a poor frontier region were simply too strong. But for 4 years, the impossible happened. Frontier settlers governed themselves, created their own laws, and operated as an independent state. Today, driving through eastern Tennessee, you can visit the sites where Franklin's government met, where Governor Sevier lived, where the legislature debated and decided the fate of their nascent state. Historical markers dot the landscape, reminding visitors that this was once a separate nation, however briefly. The state of Franklin failed, but it wasn't forgotten, at least not entirely. It lives on in local memory, in history books, and in the independent spirit of the Tennessee mountain communities that still take pride in their ancestors' brief experiment in self-governance.